Hi, and welcome to another episode of Malachi's Message Toxic Mold Sex Podcast. I'm Elizabeth Craig, co founder and executive director of Malachi's Message. Co hosting today is Emily Rochelle. She is the co founder and currently serves as our board chair. This is kind of a bonus episode in honor of PANS Awareness Day, which is October 9th of 2022. And today we have Gabriella on with us. We are so excited. She is the president of Aspire, Alliance to Solve PANS and Immune-Related Encephalopathies. She and her two children have PANS PANDAS. She has been a leader in the PANS and autism community since 2008. She focuses on educating about PANS PANDAS while providing crucial support to patients and families living with this disorder. It's an honor to have you on today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. It was so nice to get the email requesting it, and I've had a lovely time getting to know you guys a little bit in advance of the podcast. So I'm very excited to be here today.
Gabriella, I know you told us a little bit about how you became a part of Aspire, but can you tell us the mission of what Aspire is about, and then also how you got involved with it?
Absolutely. So our mission is to improve the lives of those affected by PANS PANDAS. It was designed to be broad so that we could target many key audiences, and as it gave us a little room to grow and see where our focus was going to be. Because when you found something, you have a focus and you're like, well, sometimes you realize what your niche is. You know, we're a small group, so it depends on what our sort of manpower and our volunteer power and where our energies need to focus. So it allows us to do that, but it really lets us focus on providing materials that are usable to help not just awareness, but understanding of this devastating but treatable disorder. So we create tools, our website's really content rich, kind of get lost in there. And we have a lot of toolkits too that you can download. And now we do webinars. We have a wonderful professional advisory board that creates materials as well. So we really want to be able to digest all of this information that comes at us into like something that's sort of easy to understand for your average person or legislator or mom or dad, and even certain providers who are new to it and they just sort of want a quick rundown and not even get into the nitty gritty before they get to know what it is. But I got involved in Aspire, the introduction said, I've been in the autism world for many years because I have twins who are 18 years old now, but back when they were little, one of them was diagnosed with autism. So I started going to TACA meetings, the autism community in action, when they were little. And I really found my core group of friends and moms, and began spending a lot of time with them and learning just so much from them about advocacy and support and education and how to do that. And then fast forward several years, we moved to Connecticut. I got asked to join to help with a conference on PANS. And I said, sure, I can do some paperwork. And paperwork led to me or being the conference chair and the social manager, media manager, and newsletter manager and all that communications for New England PANS PANDAS Association. And within a few months, I was president. So I was president of them. They're based in Massachusetts and do some in the more work in the New England area, but a lot in Massachusetts. And then when I was there, Connecticut. And while doing that, one thing that became very abundantly clear to me and a couple of the other presidents and board members of other PANS organizations was how much we didn't have time to be redundant. And so instead of everybody, 10 organizations creating websites with the same information, why don't we sort of try to streamline and have a different national that everybody could work off of. And so that was really, sort of like the germ of starting a national. Plus, I was also getting a lot of calls as I was doing more and more education, particular school nurses and schools for NAPANS. I was getting calls from Iowa, California, Nevada, and all these different places saying, I know you're in New England, but can you do the same thing here? And I was like, sure. So I was, at that point I was doing almost more lectures out of state than in state. And I was like, adding more credence to the idea of doing it nationally. So a couple of us got together and we founded Aspire in, I guess technically in 2019, but we seem to have talked about it for a very long time before it. So I guess it was 2019, but I keep wanting to say 2017, but I don't think that makes sense. So I started off really as vice president because I just wanted to focus on writing content because that's what I love to do. And then doing parent support, which, sort of been my mainstay with the Taco years. And being able to incorporate that, like being able to create content that parents and could understand and not feel alone and have hope. So then I became president, and I think and the rest is history. So, it's a wonderful group of people, and, and we have a lot of volunteers that may volunteer for a short period of time and may volunteer for a long period of time to help with different projects. It just depends on where the need is or where their interest is. So it's been really wonderful to be able to grow our community. And our community has grown by leaps and bounds since back in 2015 when that first conference I helped put on. The landscape has changed completely. It's still not where we need it to be, but it's gotten better.
Yeah.
So.
I love, this is totally side, but I love that you mentioned you found some of your closest friends like in that community, because I know in the mold community too, so many people that we talk to feel so alone.
Yeah.
And they end up finding like some of their best friends out of this group of everybody else trying to figure out how to wade through this. I think that's beautiful. Like, I love that that is what is happening in so many other like niche groups, as you said, but that's incredible. That's how Emily and I met. And, I would take a bullet for her now. So
right.
It's incredible. I love that.
Yeah.
Okay. So I did not know what PANS was until we experienced mold, went into the mold journey, started to meet these moms that are some of my closest friends now. And they all started to talk about PANS PANDAS. And honest to God, the first time somebody said it, I pictured the animal and went, I am so confused right now. Like, is this symbolic of something in the mold world that I just don't know about yet? So for people that are listening that are as confused as I was, would you mind explaining what PANS and I guess what PANDAS is and what the difference is between the two?
Sure. So let's just start off what those acronyms mean. It's not and then a lot of our kids also have POTS, so which is a dysautonomia issue. So we have PANDAS, POTS, and PANS. I mean, it sounds silly after a little point. But so PANS is the umbrella term. It stands for Pediatric Acute Onset Neuropsychiatric Syndrome. And PANDAS is Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Disorders Associated with Streptococcal Infections. So for a woman with a lisp, that is one heck of a tongue twister. So when I talk to schools, I say, and you're trying to explain it, say you have a third grader and you want to explain their classmates' disorder, I say, just make that into a tongue twister, and they get all very into it. So we use it. So it has nothing to do with the bear. It's not cute and cuddly. It's just the opposite. So PANS is the umbrella term, and it's really the diagnostic criteria, and the description is really what we use. Technically, the PANDAS criteria is a little different, but we're not going to get bogged down in that nitty gritty, because what you really need to know is that they're both clinically defined conditions that describe a cluster of symptoms. Okay, so clinically defined, meaning there isn't one test, there aren't two tests. It's really a clinical history of the symptoms, the patterns, the history, family history, onset, and all those things that define it. And we really look at the cluster of symptoms. So these cluster of symptoms have to have a concurrent, meaning at the same time onset as one another. Okay, so not one symptom 1 month and another one 6 months from now or 2 years from now. There are flares and things can change from time to time, but really when we're talking about that diagnostic period of when the onset, a whole bunch of them happen together. So you have to have either OCD and or restrictive eating, severely restrictive eating, not just picky eating. So you can have one, or you can have the other, or you can have both. And then you have to have two symptoms symptoms out of 2 out of 7 categories. So I'm going to list them off kind of quickly. I'm not going to go into all the details, but on our website, we have a lot of this information in a lot of detail. So anxiety, and what's really hallmark is severe separation anxiety. So it's more than just a generalized anxiety. Yes, there can be, but it's separation anxiety that is just, it sort of screams PANS. And then the second category is mood swings, emotional lability, or depression. Okay. The third is rage, aggression, what can look like a severe ODD, oppositional defiance disorder, things like that. And then the fourth category is behavioral developmental regression. And then the fifth category is related to school deterioration. Mind you, all of these symptoms can affect your ability to learn and attend school for sure, but these are very school specific. So some of the things we see are handwriting changes, dysgraphia. We may see an inability to do basic arithmetic. So we have a third grader who's working on their multiplication tables, absolutely can't add 2 + 2 suddenly, or a calculus kid can't do it. But there can be other things like delayed in creativity, whole host of things. And then we can have motor or sensory abnormalities, which includes tics. Very important. Some providers think you have to have tics. You do not. About 80% of our kids do have a certain amount of tics, but they don't have to. You can also have a co-diagnosis of Tourette syndrome and still have PANS PANDAS. Because again, Tourette's is a description of a cluster of symptoms. PANS talks about the why. So they can, and often they're very complex tics. And then the seventh category we call somatic signs and symptoms, and that includes 2 different things. One is sleep problems, inability to fall asleep, inability to stay asleep, and they're for different reasons. And then there's urinary issues, urinary frequency, urgency, bedwetting, incontinence during the day. So if you have incontinence and frequency that's not related to another medical disorder, and the OCD that's sudden onset or eating restrictions, that's very pathognomic basically for PANS. It should be a huge red flag to people. So not all kids are going to have that. So if you don't have urinary frequency, it doesn't mean you don't have PANS. It just, if you do, plus the OCD that happens sort of in the same day or week, the red flags are just like, fly them up, because that's really important. So it's also a diagnosis of exclusion, meaning these symptoms can't be described better or explained better by another neurological disorder. So it can't be a different autoimmune encephalitis. It can't be like Sjogren's or a rheumatic issue. So you want to rule out some other things before you can rule this in. And it's also PANS does not have a criteria on age. So even though pediatrics in the name, an adult can have it. These symptoms can last into adulthood, or they can start in adulthood. We just know at this point, most of our research is based on that pediatric. The reason is because strep is known as a pediatric disorder for the most part. Not a lot of adults are getting strep on a day-to-day basis. But schools, it'll just run through a school. So as PANDAS was the most studied, and we know the triggers, so I didn't speak to that, but PANS can be triggered by many things, and I'll go into that in a moment, whereas strep has to be triggered by strep. And so that's where the pediatric mostly started, because strep is a kid's disease. But as they started looking more and talking to more patients and really realizing that more than strep was triggering it, the criteria got expanded. And so when you look at a flow chart of PANS, there's the infectious triggers, and that can be pretty much any infection. There are some that we see more, like Mycoplasma, Coxsackie, and now COVID. But then there's the arm that's the non-infectious triggers, and that can be different metabolic imbalances. It can be psychosocial stress. And very importantly for today's discussion, it can be mold. So PANS this really goes back to that, being that about that cluster of symptoms. If you see the onset of symptoms at the same time concurrently, you want to know why. Okay, why is my kid suddenly like this? Why am I as an adult suddenly like this? What triggered it? And we sort of have to investigate why. And it may be strep, but it may not be. And as you all know in this group, sometimes that mold is very insidious and it can be very hard to find. And so you can look around your house, go, I don't have mold, but you have to look. So.
A lot of the symptoms, like when you were describing the symptoms, I was just thinking of my son Sebastian, but his symptoms didn't come on, like all of his symptoms suddenly, they progressed over the time that we stayed in the toxic home that caused all of his issues. Do you see a lot of kids that go through mold have those symptoms, but then lose them once they leave their house?
Yeah, so it depends on which doctor you see. That sudden onset it's still in the criteria. It's what we know for now. So if you don't have PANS, you may have something like another name of PANS, a neuroimmune condition that's just as bad and horrible to deal with. So it just, we do see it often. What we also see is mold exacerbating symptoms. So it may not be the initial trigger. We may have a kiddo whose little sister is having strep all the time, and it may be strep, it may be mycoplasma, which is one of the things that causes walking pneumonia. And they live in in a mold-filled house, and those symptoms just don't keep getting better. So like we know it suppresses the immune system, and so if you have an immune mediated disorder and there's lots of germs around you and your immune system isn't working because you're living in mold, then you're catching everything. I mean, your entire world is a really big blooming petri dish at this point, and your body can't defend against it. So you may be reacting in terms of the PANS world to everything at that point and just not getting better. And that mold also creates those same neuropsychiatric symptoms, or a lot of them. So you really have, it almost doesn't really matter. Did the mold start at whatever started? These are the things that are starting it, because the PANS treatment guidelines is based on 3 prongs. One is removing that source of inflammation. So say we have a big like Bunsen burner that's just burning everything and inflaming everything. We want to turn that off. Like we could keep putting out that fire, but you got to turn the Bunsen burner off first. So like, if it's an infection, we're going to treat it with antibiotics or antivirals. If it's the mold, we got to get out of our mold situation, right? And we got to treat other ways the mold. So it's all about, finding all of the various triggers or various exacerbators that are making the condition worse. And then we deal with the inflammation, which is the second prong of the treatment triangle. And the third prong of the treatment triangle is dealing with more the psychiatric and the symptoms and therapy and things like that. So yeah, we see mold as a problem every single day. I mean, we are always urging people, like, some of the kids, if they're not getting better right away, like after, a couple rounds of longer antibiotics for whatever infectious trigger they believe it to be, but the kid's really not getting better, or they're not able to, it's just things aren't working. At that point, we definitely urge people to look into the mold world. As much as we'd like to do it from the get-go, sometimes it's just so overwhelming. Like you can't do everything at once. Like you're in crisis mode with your kid or yourself, and you can only do one thing at a time. It's that peeling back the onion metaphor that people use in these worlds. Like it's like got to do one thing at a time and get through each layer. So if we know there's an infectious trigger, you got to turn that Bunsen burner off, because you know how to do it and you know where the valve is, and then you keep looking for the next one.
How hard is it for parents who start to see these symptoms show up and they go, I think it might be PANS? I know in the mold world, going to a pediatric doctor for our kids, most of us battled, right? Like battled for years to find somebody that would recognize what we were talking about. How easy is it for these doctors to go into mainstream medicine and get a diagnosis of PANS?
Easy is not associated with PANS at all.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just the same. Yeah, I mean, you know, even if you go to an infectious disease doctor and you say you're strep, they'll give you like the minimum of amoxicillin, and amoxicillin doesn't really work on PANS kids. So, you know, even to get sort of just basic care, pediatricians absolutely are not looking for PANS. And then a lot of them are not PANS literate at this point. So it's very tough. And so, you know, we get emails about, well, how can I get my kid assessed? And it's disheartening to not be able to say, talk to your pediatrician about it, or ask your pediatrician for a referral to this kind of doctor. Even though there are pockets of being able to do that, it's not at all the norm. And a lot of the providers don't take insurance. So it's hard to be able to, it's hard to have to say to a parent, okay, to get your kid accessed, and there's no saying that your kid has this, right? So like, just to even find yes or no, not even treatment, just like yes or no, you're going to have to be on a long wait list. Symptoms may get worse, and the answer may be no. You know, which is one reason, coming from the autism world, coming from PANS world, and knowing what I know about mold, which isn't enough, but getting there every day. I do often say, you know, if you can, try to see an integrative doctor, because if it's not PANS, you know, which it may not be, there's probably something else that they can treat those core symptoms, or the root of the problem, and sort of dig a little deeper than some mainstream doctors. But not everybody has the means to do so. So it's very frustrating. I mean, when I started, like I said, this community is getting bigger and things are getting better. One of the things is I meant by that is that I remember when I moved to Connecticut, 2012, so 10 years ago, I was looking for a pediatrician, and everybody said, yeah, but never mention PANDAS because they'll kick you out of their practice. Within a week, you will get a note saying, I'm sorry, we can no longer serve your family's needs. Please find another pediatrician. So they were summarily fired for saying, could it be PANDAS? Can you investigate if it could? And not even being demonstrative and saying, I know this is PANDAS. I read the description. My child was fine at 2 o'clock. At 5 o'clock, they had every one of these symptoms. Boom. Like really tight to the clinical description. Whereas now, I don't get those stories. I don't always get a story that my pediatrician was helpful, but I don't get the stories that I've been kicked out of my pediatrician's office for saying this.
There was a story of a mom. Didn't she go on Facebook or something? And we heard this story from a friend, but she got CPS called on her when she mentioned her kid had PANS or PANDAS at the hospital. Is that right?
Yeah. One of the people that we work with was telling me about it, and she was saying you need to talk to her, because there is apparently a whole medical stream in Texas right now that they assess you at each checkpoint as you're talking about PANS, and then like towards the end of them being close to actually like assess you, they will call CPS, because basically you're not caring for the welfare of your child by pushing a PANS diagnosis, which is insane to me. Like, because
it is insane. And
Texas
has a PANS advisory council now.
Yeah.
And, you know, that really shouldn't be happening. I mean, it shouldn't be happening regardless of having an advisory council. You know, emergency rooms are complicated business. And there's not going to be a good answer in terms of ERs for a long time, because what they see is your kid in a dangerous place.
Yeah.
And their first order of business is safety, and not just safety there, but safety at home. So they're only looking at the psych behaviors. And they're seeing a parent who can't manage the psych behaviors. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't want to do any of the psych part of that treatment triangle. Yes, it can be difficult to do. A lot of the psych meds are given at incorrect doses. The rule is start low at subacute doses and slowly titrate up as needed. And a lot of psych providers say, well, that dose isn't going to do anything. And for these kids, because they're not having an SSRI disorder, they're not having a this or that, it actually can be beneficial. And then they do see a lot of kids in severe crisis with, and I'm not placing blame on parents by any means, because I've been reluctant to go to a psych ER several times. I've had to do it, but it's a scary place. So everybody tries to avoid it as much as possible, but sometimes it puts a family in deeper water and it's depending on how they push it. So, and how they talk about the PANS. And so, PANS is long-term care, and psych wards or ERs aren't set up for long-term care. They're really just about getting you in, getting you stable, getting you out. So, part of getting a kid who's psychotic stable is a psych med. And then if a parent is constantly rejecting any of the help that the only meds that they can help with, there isn't emergency IVIG. There isn't an emergency antibiotic that's going to cut the symptoms down to a manageable level in 3 hours. So sometimes psych ERs or just an ER they don't have a lot of tools in their toolboxes, and it's not really there. They don't often make a lot of referrals or call up to any, infectious disease and things like that. So it's a tough place to be in. And there are certain states that their ER system or their hospital system, which can be, in many, many different cities, but the same hospital system, overarching one, they have rules come down from corporate, and that's that. Like, there isn't a lot of, individualized care that's happening where they can sort of see. And I've talked about this with our professional advisory board, and, doctors have literally said to members of professional advisory board, well, that parent looked like a mess. They looked like they had no control over anything. Their hair wasn't even brushed. And I'm like, I'm brushing my hair before I go into the ER with my kid who's in crisis. Like, no, like most people aren't. We live in a sweatpants society to begin with. And, some of these older doctors, they're like, oh, they look messy. And I just like, so when my son, and I don't, he hasn't had an episode in a long time, but when he was starting to spiral out of control and I didn't know what we were going to do, my first thing, and it sounds crazy, but my first thing I would do was I'd plug in my iPhone to know I'd have a full charge. I'd brush my hair, put on at least a modicum of makeup, change my clothes, and then deal with him. Like, my husband was with him, or our other son, there was a safety moment, but I was literally doing all those things to prep to have to go. Because it sounds ridiculous, but this is the world we live in. Like, you have to kind of play within their horrible system.
That's crazy.
That is crazy. I'm surprised. Nobody ever called anything on me, because I never looked nice when I went into the doctor. My hair was everywhere.
I'm not saying that's the only reason or anything like that, but I'm just saying for some places it can help, I don't know.
But to have to be careful in regards to explaining,
Awful.
what your child has, that's just because they don't know about it.
Right. Yeah. And there's also a database that some hospitals can pull from on PANS, and it's pretty antiquated. There is some work to get that changed, but then we're also waiting on things from other medical communities to come back with an updated response to how they feel about PANS PANDAS. And so a lot of doctors want to wait until that's done so that it can sort of be done and hopefully it'll be positive, but we don't know, or semi-positive, and then try to get things rewritten. It's just a back and forth thing. And there's different steps and everything. Science moves glacially slow. There was a book called, oh my God, I'm forgetting what it's called, but it was by Harriet Washington, and she writes in it, and it's all about the medical world and these conditions that can cause neuropsychiatric symptoms. And she says in there that medical world moves glacially slow, and to get anything sort of updated, you would think that it could get done, but it can take years and years for simple changes, and it's very frustrating. And unfortunately, our families and our kids and ourselves, we all feel the negative effects of that glacial slowness.
That's why when we were talking about Malachi's message, I love that you said, you feel like you've been talking about it for years. Like that. Yep, I get that. We talked about this organization for years before it started. And then part of our conversation was that going, man, okay, we could work on helping change laws, or we could work on working within the medical system. And we went, but that's going to take years and years and years. So what can we do in the meantime to actually be hands and feet for people? But I appreciate that you said that, because it's not just mold, like it's across the board with anything that is unknown and not taught in medical school right now. That is going to take years and decades for it to be recognized, if it's ever recognized, right, by mainstream medicine.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about sort of big picture, I forget which decade it was right now, but it was the year of the brain, or the decade of the brain. So everything was just in the brain, like as if the brain is not attached to the body, and it just has its own little world that it lives in, and none of the rest of our body affects it, which is ridiculous. But so we have, and then we've also, in terms of the science world, explosion of what we know about the human genome and our genes and all of that. So wanting to identify everything that happens to everybody in terms of what genes it is. It's a cluster, is it a single gene? So those are like big thought pushers in the medical world that have come before us, and they don't really speak to mold. They don't even speak to pandas. Like, yes, there is a genetic preponderance that we see, like there is a cluster of genes that we know. It's not every kid. Why isn't every kid get strep get pandas? Because there's a genetic predisposition. So it is important, but it isn't the only thing. So it's like, you've got it. It's like these mind shifts. And now, even 10 years ago, anybody that talked about the gut brain axis was like a total maverick Looney Tune. Whereas now people are like, oh yeah, well, the gut brain axis. And even though they don't even necessarily understand it, or they may not participate in enough studies about the gut brain axis, at least you are no longer like on Mars talking about a gut brain axis. So it is slow. And so what you guys, you have to support, and then keep pushing. You have to sort of split yourselves in two and know that one's the immediate care, and then changing the laws and changing and influencing the medical. It's also very involved in what our major medical institutions are focused on and what they find to be controversial, or will get them some notoriety in a good way, not notoriety in the bad way. And they don't want that because it's heavily related to funding. So they don't want to touch certain things too. And that's a really big problem. That's one of our biggest problems, in my opinion, is dealing with that, because, big pharmacy, and I don't mean to be anti-big pharma, because a lot of our treatments are big pharma based and we absolutely need them, but they do control a lot of the purse strings. And so if you go to certain medical schools, it'll say on the door, the big company, Merck, Pfizer, and so on. And then the deans of the colleges, they don't want to touch certain topics. So just funding mold, controversial. Funding PANS, stressful. And they don't want to put a ton of money in it. So it's a slow go. So when we say, one person at a time, I mean, some days it's one person at a time. And I'm like, yay, we got one person. It's like a victory. And it slowly builds that ripple.
Before we keep going, because we want to talk a little bit too about some of the misconceptions that people have when they hear the word PANS and pandas. But before we do that, we want to thank one of our corporate sponsors. And today we are thanking Kurt Carpenter Law. He's one of our tier 2 sponsors, and he has been a friend of Malachi's Message from the very beginning. The law office of Kurt Carpenter helps property owners, business owners, and entrepreneurs in Montgomery County and the Houston area who are in need of legal assistance. Attorney Kurt Carpenter focuses on property litigation, including construction, business, and real estate law. His office understands the legal issues facing property owners, business owners, and entrepreneurs in Houston because they also invest heavily in this market. If you need to speak to an attorney who has business owner and investor experience, then give them a call immediately for an initial consultation. You can learn more by visiting kwclaw.com.
So Gabriella, what are some of the big misconceptions when it comes to PANS and PANDAS that people have?
Okay, so there are three big ones to me. One is that it's rare. It is not rare. Pandas, by the strictest follow the criteria, maybe, but I don't think it even fits rare. So one of the numbers that we use often, and it's really based on a educated guess, moving in numbers of OCD, depression, things like that, is 1 in 200. I'm sure that's a low ball. There was not a population study out of Denmark a bunch of years back, and that's important because they keep a lot of data, medical data on their population. So a lot of population studies that are done out of Denmark, and their numbers, it was taking numbers of strep related illnesses and other infections and hospital stays, and all very complicated, but basically their number was about 1 in 200, 225, looking just at the pandas. So, but we know it's more than that. So what we always say in this community is it's not rare, it's rarely diagnosed. So, we will still hear pediatricians say, oh, it's really rare, your kid probably doesn't have that. But it's not true. We are listed as a resource under the National Institute GARD site, which is their rare disease site. So some circles still will call us rare, but not all. I do wish that some days that we were rare, because funding for rare disease can sometimes happen in a better way than just slightly not rare. So sometimes we'll say we're rare, or we'll talk about things on rare disease days, but it's a little, we're not rare. At the end of the day, we're just not. And also part of that problem is that doesn't really get talked a lot about, but I do like to mention it, is that it can take someone over 10 years to get a diagnosis of OCD. Not a really extreme OCD, but some of the more manageable ones, but it can take over 10 years. So what does that tell us? It tells us that most providers, even psych providers, do not recognize the symptoms and the signs of OCD. So considering that OCD is the main symptom along with the eating disorder, but a lot of that eating disorder is very rooted in OCD. Not all, but sometimes it can be, or a lot of times it can be. Our providers aren't aware of what it looks like. And in our little kids, especially, they don't have a lot of those physical compulsions that we associate it with. Most of their compulsions are mental. So you don't see it. So you don't see kids washing you do see kids with their washing hands, but say you don't have a kid who's always washing their hands, or always lining things up, or always has to sit on the right side of the car, or whatever it is. We don't see those things. So we're not like, oh, it's OCD. They're really these mental compulsions. So if it's not being recognized, then people are going, oh, well, your kid doesn't have OCD. We just see rage. Well, why are they having rage? Is it an outburst because of basal ganglia inflammation? Or is it an outburst because of the basal ganglia inflammation rooted in the fact that they can't handle their OCD and that separation anxiety? Is there intrusive thought saying, if you do this and your mom leaves, she will die? And that's a separation anxiety rooted in the OCD. So people, it's hard to recognize that. And then the second thing is that it's not a pediatric disorder. So like I mentioned in the diagnostic criteria at the earlier bit of this podcast, the P in both PANS and PANDAS is pediatric. But it's PANS diagnosis can have, there's no restriction. So it's not just pediatric. Just like juvenile diabetes, now we tend to call it type 1 diabetes because it doesn't happen just in juveniles. And then I think the third one is that it doesn't exist. It's not real. We still get that. Like I've mentioned, little bits here and there. People say it doesn't really exist, or it's really, rare, or it doesn't exist, and really the people who are saying that, there's one or two things happening. One is that they don't know the science, and they don't know, or they think they've read something and they haven't really read it closely with any real understanding of what happens with the blood-brain barrier and all the science about why the disease mechanism makes sense. What our prototype disorder, which is acute rheumatic fever for pandas, they don't know it. So if they don't know it, one's reaction is often say, well, I don't know about it, so it doesn't exist. Which doesn't really make sense, but that's what happens. And then, the other part is, there's some doctors who are hell-bent on saying it doesn't exist because it doesn't suit their own needs. And I don't want to get too politically fraught about that, but it just does happen. And different agendas and about why that happens, even though they may do research saying that PAN doesn't exist, and then the next month put out a patent on a drug that covers pandas. You're like, this could be for Tourette's, this or this, and pandas, and you're like, oh, but it doesn't exist. So that does happen, and unfortunately it's permeated some of our medical institutions like the AAP and things like that, and their red book of infectious diseases. Those are the three main ones.
So if a parent is going through this, and I know, right, thank you for clarifying that, because I honestly wasn't aware that it was not just pediatric related. And I think that was an amazing comparison of looking at type 1 diabetes and that it used to be called juvenile. So if a person, we'll say that, or a parent, because I personally know a lot of parents who are dealing with this with their children. If they're going, man, what resources do you guys have? How do you help facilitate a parent going through this? What is your guys' main structure for facilitating a parent once they contact you and say, hey, I need help with this? What process do you guys go through at that point?
Right. And, even if you're an adult, this is a lot of work about what I'm about to say. So, and some of it may have to look back and what happened to you as a kid. So even as an adult, you're probably going to need to pull your parents into this because you don't know what happened at 3. They may not really remember either, but I don't know. So first of all, take a deep breath and just breathe and remember to breathe. And you can't do all this in one time, and you can't find everything out in one day. You're just going to have to triage at this point. So say you have a bunch of symptoms with, let's just go with sudden onset for now. Or, you're not really quite sure when they started. You really want to, and you're not sure, you just know that you look at this list of symptoms and you go, that fits my kid. So my advice is, don't set out to make your symptoms and that onset fit with pandas. See where they bring you, and either it's PANS or it's not. Because treatment may be different. It may be different what kind of doctor. If you really think, you kind of build your case. We do on our website have a symptom scale rating chart and a symptom tracker, which you may not be able to apply exactly to your kiddo at that moment, but it could help you sort of frame where you're going and what you're trying to write down. So my advice would be to really familiarize yourself with those symptoms. So like I had mentioned before about the OCD and people not really understanding what it is, understand what it is. It's really important because it helps inform everything. And so even if it isn't PANS and it probably is OCD or not, you want to know. because doing all this will ultimately help you with yourself or your kiddo down the path of whatever the diagnosis is. And really, so take all those symptoms, write them down, and then write down when they started. When did you notice it? And then with the OCD part, because I said a lot of that stuff is happening in their head and we don't always know what's happening with their kiddo. They may have been having OCD thoughts getting slowly worse over the years. But we only saw it suddenly hit one day, and it may actually not be a sudden onset. So if you are working with a doctor that truly believes in that sudden onset, you need to know, they're going to want to tease out all that information. What's also really important to say, which I didn't talk about in the criteria, it's suddenly worse or suddenly worsening. So even if your kid has autism or ADHD and then suddenly things get really worse, you're like, oh my God, my kid's suddenly more autistic, or he's always been a little anxious, but now this is boom, all these symptoms got worse at once. Maybe there was a sudden onset that wasn't super acute back when he was 2 or 3. And now we're seeing actually a secondary flare of boom, oh my gosh. So you want to look at that sudden onset or sudden worsening. And if it's not sudden, I would go to a integrative doctor to try to find that root cause. But you really want to have your materials, your case history, because it is a clinical diagnosis, really well mapped out. So along with those symptoms, when they onset, you could also go through their medical file and say, were they sick that week? Or was the sibling sick that week? Types of things. Sometimes it's hard to remember, but sometimes you've got it all documented. You can see when your siblings all had strep, type of thing. Because it's very important with the strep part, you don't have to exhibit the signs of strep throat. Strep can be in other places in the body, on the skin, on the anus, in the ears, things like that. But we also may not show any physical signs of strep, but our immune reaction to strep is the PANDAS. So it's not that we're not having immune reaction to PANDAS. It's just not a proper immune response. So it could be that our siblings are all having that infection, or something or grandma's coming over every week with the mycoplasma. She keeps saying, it's just a little cough. Well, what is that little cough? Why are you doing that? Are you covered in mold, or you got mycoplasma, or whatever it is? And sort of, you really write out a case history for your kid or yourself. And then you go from there.
I'm so glad you said breathe as the first thing, because man, I was listening to that and so many flashbacks to, I know for both Emily and I, probably looking back and going, man, I remember doing that and trying to remember back, when did my kid get sick with this? When did they have these symptoms? And it is a lot of work.
Yep.
Do you have a lot of, or do you have parents that once they find out about the diagnosis, because before we started this podcast, you mentioned that PANS and PANDAS parents and mole parents, usually end up broke because the financial cost for these illnesses is so much, because a lot of the doctors aren't covered by health insurance. Do you have some parents that just want to stick their head back in the sand and just be like, nope, can't be that, because of just the overwhelming amount of?
Well, I think that, if it comes to finances, it's not necessarily one sticking the head in the sand. You can only do what you can do. You can have your 9-to-5 job. I know you can pick up an Uber route, whatever, but it may not be enough. And you may not have the energy or the feasibility. If you're a single mom, what are you going to do? You can't get more job. You still have to be home with the kids. You can't take your kid with you in the Uber to deliver food, to pay. So for those parents, I don't think it's really about putting the head in the sand. I think there are some parents, and I don't mean to malign men at any way, but we do find that the dads often want And then we see a lot of chatter from the family, especially older family members, who only see the psych symptoms. And unfortunately, we live in a world where the stigma against psychiatric illness is still incredibly strong, and it's that stigma is incredibly destructive, and it does nothing to serve any of these kids and their families. So, people will see the bad behavior, and that rage and that ODD is very, very hard to deal with. I understand that. You get a hole in your wall and you want to punish your kid and say, he's just crazy, or my kid's just a jerk, or I can't handle my kid. They don't want to see it as a neuroinflammatory response. And they just see the psych. And there are parents that see that, and we can't blame some of the ERs too for seeing that, because that's what you see. But I think a lot of families, they come from a world where they don't want to deal with any of it. And then there's some families who really want the diagnosis, because then they can say, oh, my kid doesn't have a psych issue. My kid has a medical issue. And then they don't do any of the psych part of the treatment triangle. And unfortunately, some of those kids really need ERP. So that's another part that, even if they have the diagnosis, there can be a little bit of a hand in sand. Not saying that every kid needs ERP. Certainly not every kid needs a psych med. I would never say that at all. By far, I would never say that, but a lot of them do need something. And even so a short period of time on certain things. If we have a kid who's not able to leave the house to get IVIG, that literally may save their life. We may have to do a little bit of a psych med, even though we don't like it, and makes our kid weird and, droopy and not like themselves. If we can get them to medically comply, then, and they heal, then it's be better. So we can have, there's just different ways that we get sort of stuck in our own path, whether or not we're looking for the diagnosis, wanting the diagnosis, have the diagnosis. It's just, we're still human at the end of the day. Like, we still come with our set of where we came from and our internal biases, and just our physical and mental capacity, not just our financial capacity. So it's not always about head in the sand. It's just where we are and where we can go. And, it is a paradigm shift for a lot of people to think about this as a neurobehavioral, neuroimmune issue, and we have to approach it very differently. So
why do you think we're seeing more of this now today versus back when in the 80s?
Okay.
Or the 70s? Because I feel like a lot of the parents today, that's one of the issues. It's like, well, why are so many people have these neuro issues today when they didn't back then?
Right. So we, especially in the autism world, I'm used to this question, like, is it better recognition or are there more? Okay. I think in the PANDAS world, there's a little bit of both. I mean, most people, it was only identified in the very, very late 80s, and studied at a very tight, small group of by the book strep pandas diagnosis for a couple of decades. And, as we've done a pretty good job of working on awareness, more and people more know about it, and they're like, oh my God, that's my kid. Oh, that's me. Oh, that's what happened to me when I was 6 and I didn't know it, but now I'm 40. So there is that. But if we look at PANS, we look at autism, we look at mold, we look at other neurobehavioral issues, we look at the rate of ADD, it is not just better diagnosis and recognition. It can't be, because it's not like we had kids with autism like that we just didn't simply see. Like, we didn't see all these nonverbal kids spinning in circles, flapping their hands, smearing poop. The very severe kids, like, all over in every school, and they were not all at home. And I know that's an autism example and not a PANS one, but it's a really stark difference of, like, it just didn't exist. Like, it simply didn't exist at this rate. And since we have a lot of overlap between PANS and autism, I think it's a pretty useful description. So we did not have the number of kids with this much acute anxiety that kind of started out of nowhere. So in the strep world, if we're talking about strep only for pandas, what was happening before? We were having our tonsils removed. I mean, there wasn't a kid around who didn't get their tonsils removed. I mean, it was very rare to be an adult at one point to still have your tonsils. Yeah, but see, you're older, like technically, sorry, dear.
Oh, same.
I don't have my tonsils. They were taken at 18, but I also have a PANS diagnosis. And so it's a little, anyway, not that every kid with PANS should have their tonsils out. There can be problems because they hold onto our bacteria and they their little wonder charms of, dealing with all of it, taking it and going, we won't make you deal with this pathogen. And the rate that we know is about 50-50 whether it works. It's kind of a toss-up, and the numbers aren't always so sure of whether it works or not and what you have to do after. So I'm not saying everybody run out and do that. I just want to make that clear, but it could be considered. Anyway, so I think that the strep probably didn't build up as much. That is one theory. And then, we know that our environment is filled with toxins and more toxins, and toxins don't go away. I remember a few years back, about 10 years ago, there was a study on cord, chemicals in your cord, in your umbilical cord. And there were chemicals in there in all these babies that haven't been used since 1912, 1928, 1905. It doesn't go away. So as we build them up, factories dump all this stuff into our estuaries and our waters, and it builds us into us. So we have screwed up hormones. We have this and that because of the water we drink. I mean, and it's not just one thing. It's like the overall, it just keeps until it crests and fall and bubbles over. So I think we're at that crisis point where all of the stuff that's not working in our diet, it's terrible. Even if your plate really should be half vegetables, quarter carb, quarter meat. And we're not doing that at all. So people aren't just sort of bringing in the nutrients that they have, and then they're not supplementing with, even if you do that, you often still need to supplement. And we know naturopathic medicine is, thought of as weird science for some people. And of course, a lot of that's not covered by insurance, and it's cheaper to get a McDonald's hamburger than to get a full plate of broccoli. So, I think it all contributes to this overwhelming toxic load that we have. So, it's not like mold is new. Mold may have been more controlled in some building materials at certain points. We talk about sometimes new build is worse than old build, it depends. People will say, oh, the house is brand new, but then it ends up being filled with mold. So it's not that mold hasn't been around, but people also aren't spending a lot of time as much outdoors, so they're in the mold more. Our schools are filled with mold. A lot of our schools are really old, so they're really filled with mold. Mold in schools is a massive problem for you guys and a massive problem for our PANS kids. I mean, we have kids in PANS who are did great in 5th grade, tanked in 6th grade, and there was mold all through their ceilings, or they even felt better on one hallway versus the other. We see it all the time. But our bodies are just not well equipped. Our immune systems aren't working at the ability that they should be to deal with all of this assault that's hitting them.
So do you think, because you mentioned the cord study, do you think that, as every generation that's coming about is being born basically with a more compromised immune system, which makes them more susceptible to catching these bugs and illnesses and having neurological issues?
I hope not. I hope not, but only time will tell. It makes me nervous for the future. We had a speaker this week speak on nutritional interventions for PANS, and one of our focuses is on prenatal health, preconception health, and really getting your body ready. And I do think I wish there was a lot more focus, a lot more practitioners. I wish that was sort of the norm, instead of saying, oh yeah, I need to see my doctor when I'm pregnant and maybe they'll give me folic acid. Not that and just as plug for folic acid, don't take folic acid. A lot of kids with autism have cerebral folate disorder, and they actually need folate and not folic acid. So look into that. It's a simple change. But small things can make a difference, and big things can make a difference. You know, I worry for the future. I really do. I don't mean to be all doom and gloom, but I worry about it, and which makes our work very important of having to deal with the here and now. I mean, we cannot take on the glyphosate farming faction of this world that's just putting chemicals into all of our wheat. You, me, the three of us aren't able to do that. But being able to talk about it and raise awareness, hopefully it'll get better. I don't know.
With the mold, being, I guess, more of a problem today, they talk about the correlation between the EMFs having a big it's a big reason why it's more toxic, because the mold, it agitates the mold and it causes the mold to want to go into sporulation and produce mycotoxins.
Yeah, so true. Absolutely. Really important point. And that's not going away anytime soon.
I wonder about the schools with all the computers there and the cell phones and the EMF exposure. And then, if you have mold, it's just not a really great environment. And the chemicals they use to clean those schools is just, I know a doctor right now who's on a mission trying to spread awareness about the importance of creating healthy schools and not using toxic materials and not using chemicals in there and not having these EMFs.
Yeah, I did have it written into one son's IEP for a while that they were to clean his room, and I would supply the school with approved. I had to make them accept that his entire classroom. That I tried to supply it, but they're like, no, we have to supply it because we have to prove that it's okay, blah blah. But for a while, only his desk was cleaned with his product, so we could control his desk, and then eventually the whole classroom got moved over. I don't know. It was just mom crusader moment of mine. I was like, just take it out. Yeah. I don't know. It's tough. It is tough.
And you guys have a toolkit, right? Because we're talking about schools. You guys have a toolkit online that actually Pan's mom sent me before we jumped on the interview. Shout out to Emily Brown, but she sent it to me. I was like, have you seen this? It's amazing. And she has kids that have PANS, but you guys have a toolkit that people can use.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a couple. First, I wrote just for schools and one for nurse, and sort of a medical one. And this year, actually, as I was going to go do a booth at a big nurse conference, I said, oh, this is ridiculous. Why am I doing printing? I was like, let me just make a big one. And I think it pretty much has everything from those. So it's really long. We tend to not print them ourselves because that would be our year budget. Printing's so expensive. But families, it's good to email, and families can print a couple copies for school in black and white. Made sure it looked fine. Even though there's color, certain colors don't print very well. So it does really help with the schools. It gets downloaded a lot. Like I get the things coming into my email box. I need to turn them off because so many people are downloading it, and we've gotten really great feedback on it. It's not going to tell you to try to go in there with your own thieves oil and vinegar wash to clean your desk off. But when we talk to school nurses, we do talk about, that environmental control of the kids' desks need to be cleaned off. And I always usually mention well, maybe it was something more natural, so their toxic load isn't, but I can't always make them do that. So that's not in there. But yeah, it is a wonderful school toolkit. And we have a couple other toolkits out there. And we're going to come up with new ones soon on strep, just from our professional advisory board, about all the pitfalls of testing for strep, what we treat with strep. So we always try to have some new ones coming out, but the school ones really got a lot of really good positive feedback in the past few months. I think I just put it together and it was August. And yeah, I can look at the download number and it's huge.
So where can people go? They want to learn more about Aspire. They want to get these toolkits. They want to look at this. The symptom tracker was, for me, we were concerned. My daughter had PANS. We went through mold and she's incredibly sensitive. And that was such a game changer for me. Another mom told me about it and I downloaded it, went through it and realized, okay, I think this is still just her chemical sensitivity and she still just has a little bit of inflammation because we didn't realize it at the time, but one of our vehicles had mold in it.
Oh.
And as soon as we got her out of the environment, all of her symptoms decreased. So I could align that with simply mold. But it was such I'm not going to cry, but as a parent that was already overwhelmed with dealing with a child that was so sensitive and so emotional, to have something concrete in front of me to look at was such a game changer. So sorry, I haven't cried in a while. But where can parents go to get this information and to look at these tools?
When, just so you know, when I have a support group and no one cries, I get very upset. I'm like, if no one cries, the whole thing was a failure. So today has been a success. So thank you for crying. That was really good. We needed that. So our website is www.aspire.care, CARE. So it's not .com or .org, it's .care. And we have, if you're looking for the toolkits over on the right panels, it has the different headlines. One is resources, and you click on resources, and either the second one or the first one down is handouts and toolkits. And the school one is I think the first one right now because it's new. The rating scale is probably under symptoms. So that's one of the tabs. I think it says PANS and rating scale. And there's actually one prepping for a doctor's appointment, and says some of the things are really write it down, make a plan. So that's under symptoms as well too, because we're really looking at those symptoms. It probably is under parent resources as well, but I can't remember where everything is. And if you want to email me, you just go to Aspire and contact us and we'll get an email. So
yeah, thank you.
Try to answer those within 24 hours.
Thank you so much. We're gonna have to do this again, if not before next year, and see what's changed in the world of PANS.
It's better.
Yeah, I would love to do that, and just to see how things have progressed.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity. It's wonderful to get to know you ladies, and Malachi's message does a wonderful job. Thank goodness you exist. And I know you're a real help to a lot of Texas families in particular, but you're a really lovely resource and model of what other states could do. So thank you for having this podcast and highlighting PANS Pandas for PANS Awareness Day coming up, and for use throughout the years. We really appreciate being able to have the opportunity to talk about this disorder and mold.